I want to move on to talking about hurricane season, since that's another challenge that a lot of people are dealing with here. So, you took office right after Harvey, when the area was recovering from that, and you've been right there at the table, with a seat at the table, watching this region as it, tries to come back from that. And my question is, what are some of the biggest challenges you think that stand in the way of Harris County's ability to recover?
Um, yeah, I mean it's a big question, but it's a question that we absolutely have to confront. Um, if if nothing else, because the part of the reason we're here now is because leaders from decades past did not confront this question head on. It's not a surprise that Harris County's built on a swamp, 50 feet above sea level. I mean, everybody knew that it floods. So I appreciate that conversation. It was had decades ago, but it wasn't really worked on enough. And I appreciate that after Harvey, there was at least the public pressure to say we have to do something. The problem is that the something, right, the flood bond was not enough by any means. Even back then, I remember chatting with Jim Blackburn, who you guys know is a preeminent academic in this area and advocate and in our community. And this was, I think it was even, yeah, it must have been even before folks voted on the bond, but when we knew what the size of it was going to be. And he explained to, really what we need is just a lot more. I don't know why the leaders then chose that number. But what it has caused is, a lot of disappointment in communities that say, I've sat in community meetings where they have beautifully presented, very thoughtful, very well studied proposals that the community needs. And so they can't wrap their heads around, and I can't either. I understand, why we're all frustrated, why that project can't get done. And the answer is we just don't have the money for it. As an example, the Kingwood area, I think around $10 million were allocated in the flood bond for Kingwood. Well, that's the cost of just one of the projects, but really it needs like four projects, including one really major one that costs way beyond that. And so that continues to be very frustrating. It holds the community back in terms of leadership because um, my colleagues who have defined districts, they're spending a lot of time and a lot of time of our department heads trying to fight for those, what I call we need to look forward, right? But everybody's trying to fight so that they can show their community, right, that they're trying to get whatever little bit they can. But the truth is, none of those projects on their own are transformational enough. Do they help? Yes, but they don't help enough. And a good example of one that does is the Braze Bayou project that actually had been stalled for decades, and we finally got it done. And it really, really does help that Meyerland area, and it's already shown to be helpful. Would it sustain another Harvey? Not sure, but it certainly would make things a lot better. And so we have made progress. We have new detention requirements. We've gotten other cities to adopt them, including the city of Houston. Continuing to advocate with the communities up north, that's another piece that we really need. And I think right now is a good time for the constituents up there to advocate. They were hit even harder than we were down in Harris County with the flooding about a month ago. And they're growing, so they actually can make the decision now that our predecessors didn't make in Harris County decades ago. Um, and then we're working on having buyouts more easily accessible. Anyway, I won't bend your guys' ear, but the big thing is we need another flood bond that actually will fund transformational projects. And so that is what I'm trying to encourage.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I think about this a lot in terms of the $2.5 billion bond. That sounds like so much money to people, but within the context of Harris County and the type of flood risk that we face here and how large this place is, I mean, how do you even evaluate the size of another flood bond? Is that like $100 billion bond? Like where do you even, figure out what the scale of it should be?
Yeah, it would be orders of magnitude larger. I can't say a number right now because that hasn't been fully evaluated, but at least in the tens of millions. And that kind of thing has been done in other jurisdictions when they need something transformational. Um, the good thing is there is a way to define it. So during these past floods, I spent quite a bit of time with our flood control district director, Dr. Tina Peterson, and she's wonderful. I mean, we've had some great directors, but I think she's just absolutely qualified and knows not just the sort of engineering water speak, but also the way to communicate with the rest of us. And I said, I've been talking about this since 2019 that I took office, and I am sure if we hadn't had, the flood and the fires and the COVID and all of this, we would have had more time to work on it. But also, I do feel like it's just a really tough mountain for me and my staff to climb, and like, why? What is it? And so and is it that hard to come up with it? And so what she explained is it's not that hard to come up with it. We can figure out what it is that we'll need and be really realistic about what the money is going to cover, unlike what happened obviously with the previous bond. I said, how can we totally leapfrog this? Because we all figure the problem's only going to get worse. So we do this bond and then, we're actually behind again. She said, well, the way to leapfrog it actually is a big idea like the tunnels. But that would take 25, 30 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, and just imagine how many floods we'll get from here to there. But that's something we can think about, right? And put it in plans, and maybe that's what the bond is for, or the bond helps us sustain us until then. We just have to. And I said, okay, well, why haven't you finished doing this? I've been talking about it over and over again at Commissioner's Court and private. And she said, well, we are just so consumed by our work on the previous bond. And in the work being, trying to negotiate between precincts with the little bit that is there and trying to stretch the money because projects were promised that there's just not enough money for. And there was never going to be. So, one of the things that I talked to her about and the county administrator is, couldn't we have like a separate division in her office that focuses on the future? Or we had actually created a board around this, the Community Flood Resilience Task Force, but they also kind of got sucked into the past. So that's something that I was just had a conversation with my staff yesterday in terms of like, okay, well, now that this is hopefully over, can we go back to the proactive flood control planning?
And you mentioned Project Braze, which is something I also think about a lot, where, it was a transformative project that, took a lot of structures out of the floodplain. But at the same time, like you said, if there's another Harvey, it's not clear, to what extent it would be able to protect people. And I think a lot of people want to hear, oh, this big project happened. It was a huge investment. It's done. It's complete. We're never going to flood again. And I'm just curious how you kind of balance that with public messaging, where you want to tell people this project is working, and you don't necessarily want people to have a false sense of security. So I'm wondering how you navigate that.
Yeah. So I saw a question here actually that just got my mind, and I'll answer yours in a second. But in terms of could the lack of money for the previous bond have been cost overruns and ineffective projects? So there was that in terms of inflation, and the cost of maintenance for the projects was actually not included in the bond. That wasn't thought about, but we've managed to, kind of get money from here and from there and restructure things to try to be able to afford that. And then we've even brought in people to try to evaluate whether that kind of thing is happening and try to make things more efficient. But fundamentally, there was never going to be enough money for the projects that were proposed. But anyway, to your point, I do like to say to people, actually, when we cut the ribbon on Project Braze, my communications director was really frustrated because it was like a joyful day. And I was like, this is great. But everything I just told you guys. And he was like, you just, like you're just like just putting a downer on the whole thing and what you just need to be positive. So I guess I still struggle with that. But I just want to be realistic. I do think, the way that Dr. Peterson thinks in terms of leapfrogging, really getting us somewhere where, I mean, nobody can predict the future, but there's a way in which we can really turn the page on this as much as possible. The other way to do that, or in parallel, is the buyouts. So, that's really tough for people to accept, especially neighborhoods that have been there for a while. But there are areas that are just always going to flood. And we know what those areas are, and it's a little bit of a fight, right? Like I've been wanting to put out updated maps. With that at a granular level, but then there's a lot of I don't think there's enough support for that amongst my colleagues, and obviously it becomes an issue for flood insurance costs, which there are going to be some updated FEMA maps and whatnot. But what we're trying to do there is, and part of the advocacy I've done over the past month or so, both in DC and in Houston, is for us to have an evergreen fund in our county coffers that we can use to buy people out right after they flood. When I visited the communities on the East Fork of the San Jacinto River, on the east side of the East Fork, well, both sides, they flooded quite badly up there after the heavy rains a month ago. And people, had heard about the buyouts, and they were like, can I please sell you my home? Like, this has just happened too many times, and I'm gonna rebuild, and I know it's gonna flood again. And the process takes like a year, 6 months if we're lucky. And by then people have already put down the floor, or they've had to start rebuilding, and it just doesn't make sense to sell at that point. So we have done one mandatory buyout project. It was quite fraught. Eventually it got better, but it was a lot of bumps. I'm not proud of it. I do think we learned a lot. That's not really what we're looking at right now, just because that was just really tough for everybody involved. But on the voluntary side, we at least want to make it easy for people. And we may need to start thinking again about mandatory. I don't know. And I don't know if there'd be support for that.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the idea of having sort of like an evergreen fund. Is that something are there a lot of barriers to setting that up, or kind of what's standing in the way of the county being able to do that?
Money. So in 2022, when I was up for re-election, this is something that happened that continues to affect us now. And every year we vote on the tax rate for the county. And so for as many years as we can remember, certainly with my predecessor, including the members of court that were there at the time, that had served before I took office, they would keep the tax rate the same, but the property values, as people well know, have gone up. And so that's how we could afford to cover the services for the population growth and the inflationary issues, et cetera, et cetera. And so that year, the story was Lina Hidalgo is defunding the police, and for that reason, we're not going to support the budget. And it was totally a political issue. We were actually going to add $1 billion to the police, to law enforcement budget, including a lot more police officers and assistant district attorneys and whatnot. And so, but because of politics, ultimately it was my colleagues failed to show up to the meeting, and which meant we had to adopt a very, very, very low budget. We were actually going to cut the tax rate, not just keep it the same. We were going to cut it, but we had to adopt a very, 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 very low one, which meant not only did law enforcement not get the $1 billion, but Harris County simply did not have have enough funds to cover all the services. And even worse, there's a state law that passed that says we can only increase our revenue by 3.5% from year to year. And so by cutting our revenue so much, we basically cut ourselves off at the knees for the years to come. You know, you can draw those projections and they're quite startling. So this year we're actually at a deficit and we're still trying to figure out how we're going to address that. Thankfully we do have a contingency fund for disasters, but you know, obviously that just got drawn down. So it's a money issue. And so what I've been advocating for is that the federal government, that FEMA, send us that money for us to just have. And you know, they haven't said no. So we're working with them. I've spoken with the administrator, I've spoken with the senior folks in the Biden administration, and then our county leadership is in touch with their top staff, and they apparently have something like a pilot program somewhere else in the country. So, you know, fingers crossed that we can at least do a version of that.